The gate area for Flight 127 to New York was a flurry of activity. Business travelers, families, and vacationers jostled in line as the boarding announcements crackled over the speakers. Among the crowd, Amara Williams stood out, not just for her striking presence but for the quiet confidence with which she carried herself. Before we move on to telling this story, we want to hear your opinion. Write to us in the comments, what is your name and where are you looking from? Your support is very important to us and helps our growing channel to develop and reach more people. Every comment, every like, every post brings us closer to creating a community that defends justice. Thank you for participating with us in this important event. At 27, Amara had built an impressive career as a marketing executive. Her sharp mind and unrelenting drive had earned her not just professional accolades but a lifestyle she had worked tirelessly to achieve. Dressed in a tailored navy blue pantsuit and black patent leather heels, she exuded an air of professionalism that turned heads as she stepped forward to scan her boarding pass. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Williams," said the gate agent, giving her a polite nod as the machine beeped, confirming her business class ticket. "Thank you," Amara replied with a small smile before making her way down the jet bridge. As she entered the sleek cabin of the plane, the atmosphere subtly shifted. The plush leather seats of business class gleamed under soft overhead lighting, and the faint scent of fresh coffee and cleaning polish lingered in the air. Amara walked down the aisle, scanning the numbers above the seats, looking for hers, 3A, a window seat. But as she moved closer, she noticed it wasn't just the luxurious surroundings that caught her attention. It was the passengers. Eyes followed her. Some glanced up from their newspapers or laptops, others from idle conversations. Their gazes lingered just a moment too long, some curious, others judgmental. A woman in pearls clutched her designer handbag a little tighter, and a man in a navy blazer exchanged a subtle look with his seatmate. Amara was used to this. She had encountered it countless times in boardrooms, upscale stores, and first-class lounges. The silent question in their eyes, what is she doing here? She ignored them as she always did, focusing instead on finding her seat. 3A, she murmured to herself as she approached it. She tucked her Louis Vuitton carry-on into the overhead compartment, straightened her jacket, and settled into the plush seat. It was comfortable, spacious, and came with the promise of a peaceful flight. She pulled a book from her bag and began flipping through its pages, shutting out the muted conversations around her. But shutting out the whispers was impossible. Did she win a contest or something? Someone whispered from a few rows back. These days, they'll let anyone up here, another muttered under his breath, not realizing, or perhaps not caring, that Amara could hear him. She chose not to react, keeping her eyes on the text in front of her. She had learned long ago that dignity was the best armor. A flight attendant entered the cabin, smiling warmly as she welcomed the passengers. Amara watched as she moved up the aisle, making polite small talk with others, offering drinks, and helping with bags. But when the attendant's eyes landed on Amara, the warmth flickered. Her smile stiffened ever so slightly, her gaze quickly darting away. Amara noted the change but said nothing, letting her focus return to her book. Just as the pre-flight announcements began, the same flight attendant approached her with a clipboard in hand and a too bright smile plastered on her face. "Excuse me, ma'am," she began, leaning down slightly, her voice low but firm. Amara looked up, meeting the woman's gaze directly. "Yes." The flight attendant hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I'm sorry, but there seems to be some sort of mix-up with the seating. Are you sure you're supposed to be here?" Amara raised an eyebrow, her calm exterior betraying none of the annoyance bubbling beneath the surface. She handed over her boarding pass without a word. The attendant examined it, her smile faltering briefly before returning in full force. "Ah, yes. It's just, well, there's been a seating error, and we're going to need to ask you to move to the economy section." Amara's lips tightened. She took a moment to compose herself before responding. My ticket clearly says business class. Why would I need to move? The attendant's expression didn't waver, but her tone grew firmer. It's just a logistical issue, ma'am. We need this seat for another passenger. Amara glanced around. The business class cabin wasn't full. Several seats remained empty. Her gaze returned to the attendant, her voice measured but icy. I see. And is this logistical issue something you're asking of anyone else in this cabin? The attendant flushed slightly but stood her ground. I assure you, this isn't personal. We just need your cooperation. Amara exhaled slowly, considering her options. The stares of other passengers burned into her, their curiosity feeding off the quiet tension. She could make a scene, or she could take the high road. Fine, she said, standing and gathering her things. Lead the way. The whispers intensified as Amara followed the attendant toward the economy section, where a cramped seat awaited her. She settled into it, her jaw tight, her mind racing. She had let it go this time. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. Amara sat stiffly in her economy class seat, her knees brushing the back of the seat in front of her. The downgrade from her spacious business class chair to this cramped, crowded space wasn't just uncomfortable, it was humiliating. She adjusted her blazer, refusing to let her frustration show to the surrounding passengers who glanced her way with a mix of pity and curiosity. The flight attendant who had insisted on the move had returned to the business class cabin, her demeanor bright and cheerful as if nothing had happened. Amara watched from her new position, her fingers gripping the book she no longer had the focus to read. What was that about? A young black man seated across the aisle asked in a hushed voice, leaning slightly toward her. He wore a hoodie and jeans, and his expression carried a mix of confusion and indignation. Amara gave him a tight smile. Nothing worth discussing, she replied softly. Not here, at least. He nodded, but his frown deepened. The minutes dragged on as the plane taxied to the runway. Amara stared out the window, her mind replaying the encounter over and over. The flight attendant's words, her tone, the sharp contrast in how she had interacted with other passengers, all of it was unmistakable. This wasn't a mix-up. It was something else. Something she had encountered too many times before. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, a commotion erupted in the business class cabin. A man's voice rose in frustration, his words audible even over the hum of the engines. Excuse me. I paid for this seat. Why is it still broken? I expect proper service for the price I'm paying. Amara craned her neck slightly to see what was happening. The man, middle-aged and wearing an expensive suit, was gesturing angrily at the same flight attendant who had moved her. Sir, we apologize for the inconvenience, the flight attendant said, her voice placating. I'll see what I can do to address the issue. Her tone was different now, subdued, almost apologetic. Amara recognized the shift immediately. There was no firmness, no insistence. This was the deference given to someone who was seen as deserving. Of course, Amara murmured to herself, shaking her head. The man continued to grumble as the flight attendant scurried off to resolve his complaint. A few minutes later, she returned with a complimentary drink and an exaggerated smile. It didn't escape Amara's notice that no such courtesy had been extended to her. The young man across the aisle leaned over again. I saw how she treated you. This isn't right, he said, his voice low but filled with quiet anger. Amara sighed. I've learned to pick my battles, she said, though the sting of the experience lingered. But thank you for noticing. As the flight wore on, Amara tried to focus on her book again, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She glanced up and noticed the flight attendant moving through the cabin, her eyes darting toward Amara before quickly looking away. Amara met her gaze once, holding it steady until the woman turned sharply and disappeared back into the business class section. The unease in Amara's chest began to grow. She wasn't the only one who had noticed the tension. Whispers rippled through the rows around her as passengers exchanged glances. A few people gave her sympathetic nods, while others avoided looking at her altogether. "Excuse me," came a voice from behind. Amara turned to see a middle-aged white woman leaning forward. She wore a friendly expression, though it was tinged with a hint of condescension. "I just wanted to say," the woman began, her voice hushed, "that I think it's wonderful how gracefully you handled the situation earlier. Some people would have made a scene." Amara's stomach tightened. She offered a polite but terse smile. "Thank you," she said, turning back to face forward. The woman didn't seem to catch the coolness in Amara's tone, as she continued, "You know, I'm sure it wasn't personal. Airlines are under so much pressure these days, and things like this happen. It's best not to take it to heart." Amara bit her tongue, unwilling to engage further. She had no interest in justifying her feelings or educating this stranger on the nuances of discrimination mid-flight. As the flight attendant passed by again, Amara called out, her voice calm but firm. "Excuse me." The attendant stopped, her smile faltering for a split second before returning. "Yes, ma'am." "Can I have your name, please?" Amara asked. The attendant blinked, clearly caught off guard. "I'm sorry, why do you need my name?" Amara's expression didn't waver. "I'd just like to make a note of it. For reference." There was a long pause before the attendant finally responded. "It's Karen Mitchell." Her voice had lost its cheerful veneer. "Thank you, Ms. Mitchell," Amara said, her tone polite but edged with steel. She leaned back in her seat, returning to her book as the flight attendant walked away, her shoulders visibly tense. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. The earlier whispers had turned into a quiet buzz of speculation. Amara knew the moment wasn't over. Not yet. Something about the flight attendant's reaction told her that this conflict was far from resolved. The flight carried on in uneasy silence. Amara sat in her cramped seat, watching the clouds drift past the window. She was determined to maintain her composure, but her mind churned with frustration. The injustice of what had happened refused to let her rest. The young man across the aisle, who had introduced himself as Marcus earlier, leaned over again. "You good?" he asked in a low voice. "I'm fine," Amara replied, though the tension in her voice betrayed her. "Just trying to get through this flight without making things worse." Marcus nodded, leaning back into his seat, but he didn't look convinced. As the plane hit mild turbulence, the seatbelt sign dinged on, and the flight attendants moved through the aisle to check passengers. Karen Mitchell, the flight attendant who had insisted Amara move, walked with a stiff professionalism. Her eyes avoided Amara's, but Amara felt the tension radiating from her. It was during the next beverage service that the situation escalated. Karen was handing out drinks to passengers when she accidentally spilled coffee on the armrest of the passenger sitting beside Amara. The man, an older white gentleman in a crisp business suit, yelped in surprise. "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry," Karen exclaimed, quickly grabbing a napkin to dab at the spill. Amara reached into her bag and pulled out a pack of wet wipes. Without thinking, she handed them to the man, who accepted them with a grateful nod. "Thank you," he said, giving her a small smile. Karen glanced at Amara, her face briefly flashing with an expression that was hard to read: surprise? Embarrassment? Whatever it was, it didn't last long. She straightened up, her professional mask slipping back into place. "Is there anything else I can do for you, sir?" Karen asked the man, but her voice was tight. The man waved her off. "It's fine. No harm done." Karen turned to continue down the aisle, but as she passed Amara, her words came low and sharp, audible only to her. "Don't try to play the hero." Amara's eyes widened in disbelief, but she said nothing. Her hands clenched around the book in her lap, and Marcus, who had heard the exchange, gave her a look of shock. "You're kidding me," he whispered, shaking his head. Amara took a deep breath, willing herself to stay calm. It wasn't worth it, she told herself. This wasn't the place to confront someone who clearly wasn't going to admit her wrongdoing. But the tension in the cabin had reached a boiling point. The breaking point came when another flight attendant, a younger man with a kind demeanor, approached Amara with a tray of beverages. "Ma'am, can I get you anything to drink? I noticed you didn't get anything earlier." Karen, who was a few rows ahead, turned at the sound of his voice. Her expression darkened. Amara hesitated, but before she could answer, Karen strode back down the aisle. "She doesn't need anything," Karen said sharply. "She's fine." The younger attendant looked confused. "I was just offering." "I said she's fine," Karen snapped, her voice louder now, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. Amara felt the eyes of everyone around her fix on the scene. Marcus stood up abruptly, his expression incredulous. "What's your problem?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "You've been on her case this entire flight for no reason." "Sir, please sit down," Karen said, her tone icy. "This is none of your concern." "It is my concern," Marcus shot back. "I've been watching you. First, you make her move from her seat for no reason, and now this? What, you think because she's black, she doesn't belong in business class?" The cabin erupted into murmurs. Passengers turned to each other, some whispering in agreement, others clearly uncomfortable. Karen's face flushed red. "That's not true," she said, her voice rising defensively. "She was asked to move because..." "Because what?" Amara interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "Because you didn't think I belonged there." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, and several passengers nodded in agreement with Marcus and Amara. A voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we kindly ask everyone to remain seated and calm. We'll be landing shortly." Amara glanced at Marcus and gave him a small nod of thanks before settling back into her seat. The tension in the air was palpable. Karen retreated to the flight attendant station, her expression tight and unreadable. As the plane began its descent, Amara's heart raced. She couldn't predict how this would end, but she knew one thing: this fight wasn't over. The descent seemed to stretch endlessly as the cabin buzzed with tension. Amara sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the window, but her mind was racing. Around her, passengers whispered in hushed tones, some stealing glances at Karen and others openly glaring at her. The air was thick with unease, and it felt like everyone was waiting for something to happen. Karen, meanwhile, hovered near the front of the plane, her body language tense. She exchanged whispered words with another flight attendant, her face pale but her lips pressed into a determined line. From the way she kept glancing back at Amara, it was clear she hadn't let the incident go. Suddenly, Karen picked up the intercom microphone. Her voice came over the speakers, tight and strained but still trying to project authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your cooperation as we prepare for landing. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. If there are any issues or complaints, we ask that they be addressed after we arrive at the gate." The statement, though generic on the surface, felt pointed. Amara caught Marcus shaking his head in disbelief. "She's trying to cover her tracks," he muttered. Amara didn't respond. She focused on steadying her breathing, determined to stay calm no matter what. But the calm shattered minutes later. As a flight attendant moved through the cabin collecting trash, Karen approached Amara's row again, this time with a clipboard in hand. Her face was a mask of forced professionalism, but her tone dripped with condescension. "Miss Williams," Karen said loudly, using Amara's name for the first time. "I'll need you to sign this acknowledgement form regarding the seating adjustment we made earlier." Amara frowned, confused. "Acknowledgement form?" she asked. "What for?" Karen's tone sharpened. "For record-keeping purposes. To confirm you were moved to accommodate the airline's operational needs." Operational needs? Amara repeated, her voice steady but laced with disbelief. Is that what we're calling it now? It's standard procedure, Karen snapped, her voice rising enough to catch the attention of nearby passengers. Please don't make this more difficult. Amara locked eyes with her, her calm demeanor starting to crack. I'm not signing anything that isn't true, she said firmly. The nearby murmurs grew louder as passengers began to lean closer, eager to catch the unfolding drama. Marcus stood up again, his patience clearly at its limit. This is ridiculous, he said loudly. She's been harassed since the moment she got on this plane. Now you're asking her to sign some made-up form to cover yourself. Everyone here sees what's going on. A voice from a few rows back called out, yeah, leave her alone already. Another passenger chimed in with, this is outrageous. Karen turned, her face flushing as she realized the tide of the cabin was turning against her. Sir, please remain seated, she said, her voice faltering slightly. We need to ensure compliance for safety. Safety has nothing to do with this, Marcus retorted. You singled her out because of her race, and everyone here knows it. Karen's face twisted with indignation, but before she could respond, a middle-aged woman sitting nearby raised her hand. Excuse me, she said loudly, addressing Karen. I was in business class. I saw her boarding. She wasn't causing any problems. Why did you make her move? Karen stammered, caught off guard. I was following protocol. Protocol, the woman shot back, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Or prejudice. The murmurs in the cabin turned into a low rumble of agreement. More passengers began to speak up, voicing their discontent with how Amara had been treated. Karen's composure crumbled further, and she clutched the clipboard to her chest like a shield. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, cutting through the noise. Ladies and gentlemen, we are moments from landing. Please take your seats and prepare for arrival. As the cabin quieted, Amara felt a mix of relief and dread. The landing couldn't come soon enough, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was far from over. When the plane finally touched down and taxied to the gate, Amara noticed something unusual. Out the window, she saw two police officers standing near the jet bridge. Their presence sent a ripple of unease through the passengers. Karen, too, noticed the officers. Her face drained of color as she exchanged a frantic look with the other flight attendants. She quickly gathered her things and began whispering to one of them, clearly trying to figure out what to do next. Amara turned to Marcus, who raised an eyebrow. Looks like the cavalry's here, he said quietly. The plane came to a stop, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. As passengers began gathering their belongings, two officers boarded the plane and made their way to the front. Excuse me, one of them said, addressing the flight crew. We need to speak to a Miss Karen Mitchell. Karen froze. The blood drained from her face, and she stammered, What's this about? Please step off the plane with us, the officer said firmly. The passengers watched in stunned silence as Karen reluctantly followed the officers off the plane. Whispers and gasps filled the cabin, and Amara couldn't help but feel a flicker of vindication. As she grabbed her bag to disembark, the middle-aged woman who had defended her earlier patted her on the arm. Good for you, she said warmly. Some people need to be held accountable. Amara smiled faintly. Thank you, she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. With her head held high, she walked off the plane, knowing the fight for justice was only just beginning. The jet bridge was buzzing with activity as passengers disembarked. Word of the incident had spread quickly through the cabin, and many travelers craned their necks to see what would happen next. Amara stepped into the terminal, her heart pounding in her chest. The sight of two uniformed police officers waiting near the gate brought both a sense of dread and a glimmer of hope. She couldn't shake the fear that the situation could take another turn for the worse. Behind her, Karen Mitchell walked stiffly, escorted by the officers. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. The confident demeanor she had displayed earlier was gone, replaced by a look of anxious defiance. "Miss Mitchell," one of the officers said, addressing her formally. "We've been informed of an incident on board. We need to ask you some questions." Karen's voice wavered as she replied, "Questions about what?" "I was just doing my job." The officer raised an eyebrow. "We'll discuss it further in a private room. For now, please come with us." The gathered passengers murmured among themselves, and some openly took out their phones to record the scene. Karen shot Amara a sharp glance, her expression a mix of anger and desperation. "This is absurd," Karen said, her voice louder now. "I'm being singled out because of some misunderstanding." "It's not a misunderstanding," Marcus said firmly, stepping forward. "We all saw what happened. You need to be held accountable." One of the officers turned to Amara. "Miss Williams, would you mind staying for a few moments? We'll need a statement from you about what occurred." Amara nodded. "Of course. I'll do whatever is necessary." Amara, Marcus, Karen, and a handful of other witnesses were escorted to a quiet conference room near the gate. The airline's manager on duty arrived shortly after, his face tight with concern as he surveyed the scene. The police officer who appeared to be leading the investigation gestured for everyone to take a seat. "Let's keep this professional," he said. "We need to establish the facts." Karen crossed her arms tightly across her chest, glaring at Amara. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath. The officer ignored her and turned to Amara. "Miss Williams, can you explain what happened from your perspective?" Amara took a deep breath, her voice steady but resolute as she recounted the events. "When I boarded the plane, I took my assigned seat in business class. Not long after, Miss Mitchell approached me and asked me to move to economy. She claimed there had been a mistake. When I asked why, she became defensive and insisted I leave the seat. I didn't want to cause a scene, so I moved." She paused, glancing briefly at Karen, who avoided eye contact. "After that, it was clear from the reactions of other passengers that I was being treated differently because of my race. When I asked for clarification, Miss Mitchell was dismissive and rude. Other passengers supported me, but she refused to listen." The officer nodded, taking detailed notes. "Did anyone else overhear the conversation or witness this?" "I did," Marcus said, his tone firm. "I saw the whole thing. Karen's behavior was discriminatory and completely uncalled for. Amara had every right to sit in that seat." Several other passengers who had followed the group into the room nodded in agreement. A middle-aged woman spoke up, her voice tinged with indignation. "I was seated nearby. It was obvious Miss Williams was being targeted. There was no mistake, just prejudice." Karen shot the woman a sharp look. "You don't know what you're talking about," she snapped. "This was a procedural decision, nothing more." The officer raised a hand to silence the growing tension. "Miss Mitchell, you'll have a chance to give your statement shortly. For now, I'm gathering evidence." Karen leaned back in her chair, her arms still crossed, muttering under her breath. After nearly an hour of questioning and statements, the officers stepped out to confer privately. When they returned, their decision was swift. "Miss Mitchell," the lead officer said, "based on the testimonies we've received and the corroborating witness accounts, we're placing you under arrest for discriminatory practices and violating anti-discrimination laws." Karen's jaw dropped, her face twisting in disbelief. "What? You can't be serious. This is a misunderstanding. I didn't do anything wrong." The officer remained calm but firm. "You have the right to contest this in court. For now, you'll need to come with us." As the officers began to escort Karen away, her protests grew louder. "This is insane. I'll lose my job over this. You're ruining my life." Amara watched silently, a heavy mix of emotions swirling inside her. Relief that justice was being served, but also sadness that it had come to this. She hadn't wanted a confrontation, but Karen's actions had left her no choice. Before Karen disappeared from view, she turned to Amara one last time. "This isn't over," she spat, her voice venomous. Amara stood tall, meeting her gaze without flinching. "You're right," she said quietly. "It's just beginning." The room fell silent as Karen was led away, leaving behind a trail of murmurs and the unmistakable weight of accountability. The events on the flight quickly became national news. By the time Amara returned home, she was inundated with messages from friends, colleagues, and even strangers who had seen the viral video of the incident. Headlines ranged from "Racial discrimination in the skies" to "Business class bias sparks arrest." The video, recorded by another passenger, showed Karen Mitchell demanding Amara move to economy class and her dismissive attitude when questioned. The footage, coupled with eyewitness accounts, painted a clear picture of the blatant discrimination. But this was only the beginning. A few days later, Amara received a call from a civil rights attorney, Rachel Torres, who specialized in discrimination cases. "Miss Williams," Rachel began, her voice warm yet professional, "what happened to you was unacceptable, and I believe we can hold both the airline and Miss Mitchell accountable. Are you willing to fight this legally?" Amara hesitated for a moment, reflecting on how exhausted she already felt from the ordeal. But then she thought of the larger implications. If she didn't speak up, who would? "Yes," Amara said, her voice resolute. "I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Rachel wasted no time filing a civil lawsuit against the airline, citing racial discrimination, emotional distress, and failure to train their employees to uphold anti-discrimination policies. The case gained momentum as more passengers from the flight came forward to support Amara's claims. Their testimonies added weight to the argument that Karen Mitchell's actions weren't an isolated incident but a symptom of deeper systemic issues. The airline's legal team attempted to settle quietly, offering Amara a modest sum and a public apology. Rachel advised against accepting the initial offer. "They're trying to sweep this under the rug," she explained. "You deserve more than money, you deserve accountability." The case went to court, drawing significant public attention. Media outlets covered the proceedings daily, framing the trial as a pivotal moment in the fight against racial bias in corporate America. Amara took the stand, her testimony calm yet powerful. "I didn't ask for special treatment," she told the jury. "I simply wanted to sit in the seat I paid for. Instead, I was treated as though I didn't belong, not because of a mistake, but because of the color of my skin." Karen Mitchell, too, was called to testify. Her demeanor in court was markedly different from the self-assured flight attendant seen in the video. Under questioning, she admitted she had assumed Amara's ticket was a mistake, but she insisted it wasn't racially motivated. "I was following protocol," she said defensively. "I didn't mean to offend anyone." The prosecution dismantled her argument by pointing out inconsistencies in her statements. They presented evidence of other complaints against her for unprofessional behavior, though none were as overtly discriminatory as the incident with Amara. The video footage was shown to the jury, and Karen's dismissive tone and body language spoke louder than her words. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury ruled in Amara's favor. The airline was found liable for failing to prevent discriminatory practices, and Karen Mitchell was found personally responsible for her actions. The court awarded Amara significant monetary compensation for emotional distress and loss of dignity. The airline was also ordered to implement comprehensive anti-discrimination training for all employees, ensuring such incidents wouldn't happen again. Karen Mitchell, meanwhile, faced additional consequences. As part of a plea deal in a separate criminal trial for violating anti-discrimination laws, she was sentenced to 1 year of community service and required to attend sensitivity training. Outside the courthouse, Rachel Torres addressed reporters. "This case isn't just about Miss Williams," she said. "It's about challenging the biases that still exist in our society and ensuring accountability at every level." Today's verdict sends a message that discrimination in any form will not be tolerated. Amara stood silently on the courthouse steps, watching the crowd of reporters and activists who had gathered. She felt a wave of relief and validation, but also a deep sense of responsibility. "Do you have any comments?" one reporter called out. Amara stepped forward, choosing her words carefully. "This isn't about revenge," she said. "It's about justice. It's about making sure no one has to go through what I did. We're all human, and we all deserve to be treated with respect and dignity, no matter the color of our skin." The crowd erupted in applause, and Amara realized that her ordeal had become something much bigger than herself. Her fight for justice had sparked a broader conversation, one that she hoped would lead to lasting change. As she walked away from the courthouse, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't the end of the journey, it was the beginning of something much greater. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the final verdict was read. Amara Williams sat in the front row, her eyes locked on the judge, her heart racing with anticipation. The past several weeks had been a blur of media attention, public scrutiny, and endless legal battles, but now, finally, it was all coming to a head. The judge, a seasoned man named Judge Michael Anderson, cleared his throat and spoke in a voice that commanded attention. "After reviewing all the evidence presented in this case, the jury has reached a decision." The silence in the room grew thicker. "The defendant, Karen Mitchell, is found guilty of racial discrimination under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Furthermore, the court finds the airline, Skyway Airlines, responsible for fostering an environment that allowed such discrimination to occur, and they too are held liable." A collective sigh of relief swept through the room, though it was tempered by the weight of the moment. Amara's hands shook slightly as she gripped the armrest of her chair, the magnitude of the victory starting to sink in. Judge Anderson continued, "Miss Williams, as a result of this verdict, the court orders Skyway Airlines to pay compensatory damages in the amount of $500,000. In addition, Miss Mitchell is hereby sentenced to 1 year of community service and mandatory sensitivity training, to be supervised by the Department of Justice. The court also orders Skyway Airlines to implement anti-discrimination training and policies across all levels of their operation, effective immediately." Amara's attorney, Rachel Torres, sat beside her, her face breaking into a small but proud smile. The legal battle had been long and exhausting, but they had finally succeeded. When the judge banged his gavel to signal the close of the proceedings, the air felt charged with both relief and triumph. Amara had won. She had been heard. And, more importantly, she had brought accountability to a system that too often turned a blind eye to racial discrimination. Though Amara felt a rush of emotion at the outcome, she couldn't ignore the bittersweet feeling that lingered. Justice had been delivered in the form of a court ruling, but she knew that no monetary compensation or sentencing would undo the psychological damage that had been done to her. As she left the courthouse with Rachel, the weight of the case seemed to lift from her shoulders, but only for a moment. The reality of the media frenzy hit her again as camera flashes erupted from the crowd of reporters outside. "Miss Williams, how does it feel to win the case?" one reporter shouted. Amara turned toward the group, her expression calm but resolute. "It feels right," she said, her voice steady. "But this case isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. The fight for equality isn't over. It's just beginning." She looked over at Rachel, who gave her a small nod of approval. "There's still work to do," Rachel said quietly. Amara smiled, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. She had taken the first step towards something bigger than herself, and she knew her journey wasn't over. In the weeks that followed, the case continued to make headlines. Skyway Airlines announced sweeping changes to their employee training programs, vowing to ensure that what had happened to Amara would never happen again. They also made a public apology, although many saw it as little more than damage control. Despite their efforts, the airline's reputation had been irrevocably tarnished. As for Karen Mitchell, the flight attendant who had sparked the controversy, her life had taken a dramatic turn. She was required to complete her community service in a variety of settings, including working with marginalized communities to understand the impact of racial prejudice. Public opinion about her was divided. Some believed she was a scapegoat, others felt her actions warranted harsher consequences. But for Amara, the court's decision was about more than just the outcome, it was about the larger message it sent. She had forced the public to confront the deeply ingrained racial biases that existed, even in places where they were least expected. And that, in her eyes, was the true victory. As the months passed, Amara's life slowly returned to normal. She continued her work in marketing, but now she found herself speaking at events, sharing her story, and advocating for racial equality. The media attention had died down, but the impact of the case remained. Amara became a voice for change, participating in campaigns that focused on racial justice and anti-discrimination efforts in corporate America. The case had also inspired other individuals who had experienced racial discrimination to come forward, emboldened by the outcome of Amara's lawsuit. Civil rights organizations praised the case as a landmark victory and used it as a model for future litigation. Amara kept in touch with Rachel, her attorney, who became a close friend. They often spoke about the work still needed to fight systemic racism, but they both agreed that the progress made in Amara's case was a significant step forward. One evening, after a long day of meetings and advocacy events, Amara sat alone in her apartment, reflecting on how far she had come. She looked out the window, watching the city lights blink in the distance, and felt a sense of peace. She had fought for justice and had won, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been discriminated against. She thought back to the moment when she had boarded that plane, feeling the stares of the passengers, and how everything had unfolded from there. It had been painful, but it had also been transformative. Amara stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city, a quiet sense of pride swelling inside her. Her victory was not just a personal triumph, it was a triumph for everyone who had been treated as less than because of the color of their skin. And while there was still much work to do, she was determined to be part of that change. Justice had been delivered, but the fight for equality, for true justice, would continue. And Amara would be there, leading the way. The weeks following the trial felt like a whirlwind for Amara Williams. While the media frenzy surrounding the case had simmered down, the echoes of her victory continued to ripple throughout society. She had ignited a conversation, one that wasn't just about a single incident of discrimination, but about the systemic issues that plagued the entire framework of institutions, from airlines to schools to corporate offices. But as she continued with her life, the lessons learned from that experience began to shape her future in ways she never anticipated. News outlets had hailed the verdict as a landmark case in the fight for racial justice. Civil rights groups celebrated the outcome, calling it a sign that change was possible even in industries where discrimination was often invisible. However, the reaction from the public was far from unanimous. Some defended Skyway Airlines, arguing that the flight attendants' actions were out of line but didn't necessarily reflect a broader corporate culture of discrimination. Others believed that the ruling was a form of political correctness gone too far and felt that Karen Mitchell was being unfairly punished. On the other hand, there were many who saw the case as a wake-up call, a harsh reminder that racial biases were deeply embedded in many systems of power. Amara, though grateful for the support and recognition, didn't let the media attention cloud her judgment. She knew the fight wasn't over. The case had simply opened a door to a much larger conversation that needed to be had, one that had been ignored for far too long. Amara didn't bask in her success for long. Instead, she immediately began using the platform her case had given her to continue advocating for racial equality. She became a speaker at events dedicated to diversity, equity, and inclusion, addressing how unconscious bias manifested in daily interactions, often unnoticed by those in positions of power. She worked with organizations that focused on racial justice, using her story as an example of how small acts of discrimination could snowball into larger systemic problems. Her involvement in various initiatives gave her a new sense of purpose. No longer was she just the victim of an isolated incident. She was now a part of something much bigger, a movement that aimed to transform the way society viewed race, privilege, and power. Amara even began collaborating with Skyway Airlines to help create an anti-discrimination program, partnering with their HR department and consulting with experts in racial justice. She was determined to make sure that no one else would have to endure what she had gone through. Karen Mitchell, a journey of reflection. For Karen Mitchell, the aftermath of the trial was even more complicated. Though she had been sentenced to community service and mandatory sensitivity training, the impact of her actions would follow her for the rest of her life. The public backlash had been intense, with many questioning her character and motivations. But what happened after the sentencing was where her true journey began. In the months that followed, Karen spent time volunteering at local community centers, working with marginalized groups in an attempt to atone for the harm she had caused. While some believed her actions were just a result of poor judgment, others saw them as the product of deep-seated racial prejudice. It was hard for Karen to reconcile with the fact that her actions, however unintentionally motivated, had caused so much pain to someone who had done nothing but show up for her flight. One afternoon, Karen attended a community dialogue event, where she was invited to speak about her role in the incident. The room was filled with people who had either faced discrimination or had actively been working to fight it. She was nervous. This wasn't a room of easy forgiveness, but she knew it was a conversation she needed to have. As Karen stood in front of the group, her voice trembled at first. "I never intended to hurt anyone. But I see now that my actions were part of something much bigger. I've had to confront my own biases, and it's been painful. But I'm committed to doing better. To understanding the impact of my actions and learning from this." The room was silent for a moment, and then one of the attendees, a black woman, stood up and walked toward Karen. "We all make mistakes," she said softly. "But it's what we do after that matters." Karen was humbled. She didn't know if she would ever earn forgiveness, but she understood now that this was about more than her. This was about the legacy of systemic racism that needed to be dismantled one conversation at a time. In the quiet of her apartment, Amara sat by the window one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. She thought about everything that had happened, the public outcry, the courtroom drama, the overwhelming support from so many strangers, and the anger she had felt when Karen first asked her to move from her seat in business class. But now, as time passed, her perspective had changed. The entire experience had given her a deeper understanding of how deeply ingrained discrimination was in society, even in small, seemingly harmless interactions. She understood now that the fight for racial equality wasn't just about holding individuals accountable, it was about changing systems, challenging assumptions, and making sure that everyone, regardless of their skin color, had an equal chance to succeed. She thought about Karen and the journey she had embarked on. People, she realized, weren't perfect. They made mistakes, often based on ignorance or inherited biases, but they could learn. They could grow. And that gave her hope. Amara knew that the struggle for justice was ongoing. But her victory had shown her that even the smallest actions, speaking up, demanding accountability, standing firm in the face of injustice, could create ripples of change that spread far beyond their original source. As she continued her advocacy work, she began to see tangible progress. More companies were taking steps to address racial inequality. More individuals were willing to speak out about their experiences with discrimination. And slowly, but surely, the conversation was changing. For Amara, the lesson was clear: change was possible, but it required everyone to be a part of it. She had learned that true justice came not from a single verdict, but from the willingness of individuals and society as a whole to confront uncomfortable truths and do the hard work of dismantling the structures that upheld inequality. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her journey, but also the power of the steps she had taken. There was still so much work to do, but with each lesson learned, she knew she was closer to the world she envisioned, a world where skin color no longer defined a person's worth or potential. And as she looked ahead, Amara felt more determined than ever to continue the fight, knowing that every step she took was one closer to the justice and equality that everyone, regardless of race, deserved.